Greetings, unsettled souls, and welcome to the Correct Views. Sam IB de Gangi doing political commentary here for the Media Speaks, and it's Fukushima time again. I've got so much Fukushima news, unfortunately, none of it's good, that the show's actually going to be in the course of 2 days. I don't know if I'm doing one tomorrow or if I'm going to do it Monday. If you guys really like it, let me know in the comment line, and I'll see if I can get off my lazy keister and do it tomorrow night. All right, guys, I'm going to get straight to it. The reason I seem kind of glum is I've got two shows worth of information and news here on things that are extremely important to every man, woman, and child, as it were. And it's like crickets. There's absolutely nothing from anyone. It's almost like everybody in the whole world has all gone to sleep at the exact same time. Listen to this. This is on Washington'sBlog.com. American government forces restart of Japanese nuclear reactors. Now, you might ask why in seven hells America would care whether or not Japan ran its nuclear reactors. Westinghouse, American company, they're tied into the construction of these monsters. And you also have, again, TEPCO. I hope by now, at least anyone that's heard this show should know that TEPCO, who's TEPCO, Christelle? Well, yes, but I hit it with that out of nowhere. They are, in fact, General Electric. And it's the Japanese branch. What I'm saying is America is tied into a lot of this. There's a lot of money to be made in how the story ends with this terrible meltdown that was under control. And look, Nuke was safe after all. Fortunately, that's a lie. It's just a lie that's very good for the bottom dollar of a lot of people that are tied into these sorts of insane notions. And again, a lot of it, like Helen Caldicott says, is tied to the nuclear weapons industry. And you can see this. They say there's no connection. And yet, when you hear about what it is that Iran wants to do, potentially with some of their nuclear offspring, if I may coin the phrase, from the reactors, you can tell right away what it is that they're trying to do. My screen just jumped for those of you. All right, guys, listen to this. Americans are largely responsible for Japan's ongoing nuclear policy. By Americans, they don't mean you and I, they mean our leaders. Archaic nuclear reactor designs, that's very old designs, such as those at the Fukushima, built by the American company General Electric, were chosen because they were good for making nuclear bombs. Did you hear that? It's about power and energy and saving the planet. The U.S. secretly helped Japan develop its nuclear weapons program starting in the 1980s. There wasn't much global warming talk in the 1980s. Therefore, the U.S. played a large role in Japan's development of nuclear energy. After the Fukushima disaster, in an effort to protect the American nuclear industry, what can you do to stop this? You can get your money out of GE. You can get your money out of anything that's in a mutual fund that's tied to a nuclear power plant. If you must be in mutual funds, and I don't suggest it, I go to infrastructure nuclear funds because it doesn't contribute to things like this. Because in an effort to protect the American nuclear industry, who your tax dollars support, the U.S. has joined Japan in raising acceptable radiation levels. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also signed a pact with her counterpart in Japan, agreeing, and there's links all over this for those of you that doubt me, agreeing that the U.S. will continue buying seafood from Japan, despite the fact that the FDA is refusing to test seafood for radiation in any meaningful fashion. So U.S. actions are helping to protect the pro-nuclear policy in Japan. Do you understand that? How many of you eat fish or any kind of seafood at all? Do you know that you're probably eating it thinking that Fukushima is safe? Well, let me ask you something. It's safe based on what? Because they're not testing it. You know that. They're not testing it. I talked about this in 2012 when I went and we made the movie Bilderberg, Why It Matters to Me. Look it up. It's online. You can't be eating seafood. If you're going to eat anything at all, make sure it's from at least the East Coast or from the south of the equator. But the problem is you don't know where your food comes from. And it's very hard to trace it back. Just because it's manufactured or processed somewhere doesn't mean that you know where it's from. Says indeed, mainstream Japanese newspaper Nikkei reports that it was President Obama and Clinton who has pressured the Japanese to restart that country's nuclear program after the Japanese government vowed to end all nuclear power in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. Bet you didn't know any of this, did you? Japanese media has been saying for some time that it was the US government who pressured the Noda administration to drop the zero nuke by 2030, which morphed into zero nuke sometime in the 2030s, from its new reactor and environmental policy decision. It says it's hard to believe that this president has time for trivial matters like actually governing the affairs inside and outside the U.S. during an election year. Friends, there's a lot of money in this, and we know that nuclear power is absolutely impossible to exist without subsidies, which is tax dollars that you and I are paying to be poisoned. Do you know even when they run properly? Are you aware that there are myriad of studies? It won't be hard for you to check it if you doubt me on this. There are a myriad of studies that have talked a lot about how even when these plants are running properly, cancer rates are through the roof. Look up what a routine release is. The aforementioned Caldecott said, it's just a routine cancer. There is no such thing. And that's what these routine releases cause, by the way. Listen to this, New York Times. Japan committed to nuclear power despite the Fukushima fiasco. With the pull of a lever, control rods were lifted Tuesday from the reactor core at a plant in southern Japan, ending a ban on nuclear power following meltdowns at Fukushima. In other words, they took the nuke plants away, and now they're bringing them back again. And don't give me this BS about global warming. First of all, man is not warming the planet, and the planet has not warmed at all in the last 15 years. Those two things are absolute fact. Beyond that, even if you were someone that believed falsely, as it were, that man was warming the planet, that wouldn't matter, because the amount of energy that is used just to mine uranium in order to make the plants run are worse for the environment than a coal plant is. So this is not helping the environment. Crowded, energy scarce Japan remains committed to nuclear power despite the March 2011 incidents, which has seen cancer fly through the roof. We'll get to that in a minute. Polls show that most Japanese don't want nuclear power, but public opinion has been trumped by leaders who say keeping the country's 43 workable reactors offline forever would be too damaging economically. Yeah, economically. Never mind the fact that putting them back online, especially in what is currently and still an active earthquake zone, could jeopardize the lives of millions of people. That doesn't matter. What matters is that we can keep these reactors going for the good of the bottom line, which is going to benefit the people that are in office now. They may not even be in office in a couple years, and nobody will remember who they are, and they will have gotten away with this. It's interesting to note how many people, by the way, have a lot of stake and stock in all things nuclear, how often they own homes and on faraway islands and south of the equator where there are no nuke plants. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? Because they know exactly what they've invested in. They know where their money has come from, and they know where they don't want to be. Though two other nuclear reactors briefly resumed operations after the Fukushima meltdowns, we covered that here. Japan has gone completely without nuclear power for nearly 2 years under tighter new regulations, which would have been, sanity. Reactors remained idle pending safety inspections. Nuclear plants had provided nearly a third of power generation before they were taken offline. So Japan ramped up the use of coal, oil, and gas to compensate. That has increased energy costs and slowed Japan's progress toward reducing emissions. To hell with emissions. You're not warming the planet. Nuclear is worse for you than the damage that coal does to your lungs and the air, so you can't argue that. The people of Japan have been paying more, and you know what? They're still on the side of not having the reactors. So you can't make it an issue of energy price because the people of Japan are not demanding this. It's being forced upon them. It said nuclear power plants had provided nearly a third of power generation before they were taken offline. So Japan ramped up the use of coal, oil, and gas. Well, I bet they did. And it hasn't hurt anything. If anything, the amount of cancers, maybe lung cancers could go up, but every other cancer is going to go down because there's not all these routine releases going on. So this idiot. Nuclear power is indispensable. Industry Minister Yoichi Miyazawa, Miyazawa, said Tuesday, pledging to put safety first on the Sendai 1 nuclear reactor as it resumed operation. Safety first would mean shutting it down. Safety first would mean never having built it to begin with and dismantling it as quickly as possible and getting all of these things off of the Japan islands for good, because it's still an earthquake zone. We still have issues there dealing with this awful mess that they've started. It says Japan's 126 million people live smack on the Pacific Rim of the Ring of Fire. It's a seismically active region. That means lots of earthquakes for you Lady Gaga fans. Studded with volcanoes and riven with major geological faults. That means things that cause meltdowns. And remember, the earthquake was causing some of the meltdowns prior to the tidal wave ever reaching. It's fact. You can look it up just by studying the way the plant melted down. It's online. It's not hard to find. The country invested heavily in nuclear power to help alleviate its nearly complete reliance on imported fuels. So it's all about the money. And even though the people are paying more for energy and they don't want nuclear, it's going to be forced upon them because of the amount of money that a very small number of people are making. Largely unelected. It says utilities are seeking approvals for restarts of 23 other reactors, including the second at Sendai. 2 others are under construction. They want to build more. Many communities don't want their reactors back online, and experts are idled plants deteriorate quickly. Yeah, so they need to be dismantled and taken down. The average Japanese citizen seems to be understanding this. And it looks like, remember Greece, they voted to leave the European Union if they had to, and the government they elected to stand up for them, stab them in the back. That's what you're seeing here in Japan. It's the same vile people, the same evil banks that fund the nuke industry to some degree are the same ones that are forcing this thing along in Japan because they need the money tied up into this. You can follow the same trail to the same number of organizations, and wherever it leads, it's always bad for the average person. Thankfully, the average person in Japan seems to be getting it. It's time to occupy nuke plants. I don't mean violently. I just mean if they're going to drill there, camp there, refuse to let them break ground. Do not leave. Thousands of you. They can't arrest thousands of you. They can't put you all in jail at one time. Where are they going to put you all? It's not going to work. And only these kinds of actions are going to lead to these things not being built. And there are other things you can do to have them, of course, shut down. But you need a lot more people. I get a few hundred people that watch these. That's great. We need a lot more people than that if we're going to be able to do anything. And you can see what it's doing all around us. Listen to this. Sputnik News. 50% of young people living near Fukushima are suffering from thyroid cancer. 50% of the people who are near the nuke plant have thyroid cancer. Vladimir Slivyak, it's Slivyak, from Russian NGO Eco Defense, and Harvey Wasserman, an American senior editor and columnist, discussed the horrendous situation in Japan, where over 48% of some of the 360,000 young people have recently been identified as suffering from precancerous thyroid abnormalities. Anybody still wanting to debate me about how safe nuclear is? 39 months after the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan, which is much quicker than many people thought that it would show up. But I've been saying all along, at these high of doses, it was exactly what you were going to see, unfortunately. The biggest terror ever, cancer. Only now are the Japanese authorities getting around to organizing extensive health checks, despite the fact that incidences of cancer are up 40 times. Japan's prime minister is attempting to restart the country's nuclear program, which I just said a minute ago. It said, how accurate is the research carried out by Japanese authorities? This is Wasserman. Very accurate. The Fukushima Medical University is a private institution, but it gets government money. It is one of the few independent agencies that's been looking into the health effects of the Fukushima accident. One thing that the nuclear power industry has been very good at over the decades is not studying the health impacts of nuclear power. And in this case, we have an independent institution which is gathering data. So what did they find? The study has been involving somewhat more than 400,000 local children, and there have been results that have come in about 250,000. We've had 40 times the normal thyroid cancer death rate, and 40 times the normal or thereabout thyroid abnormality rate, cysts and tumors and other problems with the thyroid among children. And the number is going up, as you would expect, because the iodine that came out of Fukushima affected people. But the effects continue to spread over the time, and we expect the situation to get worse. In other words, it just washes into the ground, it rains, it falls again, falls on another community, soaks it up, repeat, repeat, repeat. It can juice you more than once. It'll do it for the entire life. And iodine, I think, I want to say the half-life is over 30 years. They ask, has there been a press clampdown on information surrounding children's cancer rates? As far as I can see, over the last 8 to 12 months, there's been hardly anything at all about any mainstream media press over the whole world. And this is Wasserman again. Right, it is actually the corporate press that is refusing to cover this. There has been some coverage among the websites, like the one I edit, nukefree.org, and especially now after net neutrality goes away, which is why you should keep an eye on that. This coverage won't get anywhere. The reality is that the corporate media has clamped down entirely on this. And of course, in Japan, with the support of the American government, the very pro-nuclear Shinzo Abe regime has passed a state secret act where you are actually in jeopardy for your health and safety if you publish facts about the damage from Fukushima. They're doing everything they can to lie to all of you about what's happening here, and I'm giving you the facts. Hit share on this, friends. Get this out to other people. If you know someone eating seafood, smack them in the head. So this is a serious situation, and we know that the Soviet Union and the old Soviet Union states, Belarus and Ukraine, have not been particularly forthcoming about what was happening either. And we know, look up Belarus deformities, Chernobyl deformities. You'll see what they're talking about here. It goes on, the corporate nuclear industry with its power within the corporate media does a very good job of suppressing the health data that shows the damage, and of course the denials are automatic and extremely well funded. So I gather that the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation is issuing reports which seem to downplay or not mention it at all the problems connected, to the Fukushima on humans after the accident. Wasserman. No, the UN is actually a very pro-nuclear organization. You have the UN and the IAEA, which actually promote nuclear power, and they have an agreement with the World Health Organization where the promoters of the nuclear power at the UN censor any finding about Fukushima or any other nuclear accident. Again, you can look this up. Here are the sources. Look up Wasserman's work here. Last November 7th, he says, I presented with a grassroots organization 150,000 signatures to the UN, to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, asking that a world body take over the situation at Fukushima and deal with the ongoing disaster. And we have never gotten a response. 150,000 signatures personally delivered to his office and no response whatsoever. And it says, why are some governments planning to restart these reactors? Here's what he says. What is happening now is that the effects of the Fukushima accident have really been felt in Japan, and the people have responded by forcing the shutdown of 54 reactors in Japan, as they should do. It said that the Daily Mail, that's another paper, of course, has just published an article that the Prime Minister of Japan has revealed the new basic energy plan will push to bring the country's 48 reactors back online. Does that make anybody really concerned, or just me? The earthquakes are still happening there. They're reported on all the time. It's not even rare. And yet, out of nowhere, it's like somehow nobody sees any of this. None of this is real. None of it matters. And friends, what I'm going to do here in a minute is get on to how this actually affects you in part outside of Japan. Before I do that, and don't zone out, I want to make sure I give a shout out to Sticker Junkie. Awesome to have a company that makes things this awesome as a sponsor of the show. Go to stickerjunkie.com. Let David Lake know that you heard about the Sticker Junkie from the Correct Views. You're going to get a discount on your stickers when you do that. Also, make sure you go to... you can look up Passing Time, the Alexandrian Solution. I'm Sam from Passing Time at youtube.com. There's a video up where I want to give you this ticket to come see Pop Relief itself, but legendary Cleveland Agora. I'm going to be opening that show with my band Passing Time. You're going to get autographs from Pop Relief itself. You're going to get all kinds of really cool stuff just by doing what the video says. It should be a really cool contest. The video is like, 5 minutes long, something like that. YouTube.com/Sam from Passing Time. And of course, look up the Alexandrian Solution Passing Time. We come up immediately. The most recent video there, the contest, is the one that's going to attract you, I'm sure. Friends, listen to this. Moving on as to how this affects you. Seafood lovers, beware of something fishy. And this is nzherald.co.nz. Not particularly good news here. Seafood lovers are being warned that their fishy feast could contain high levels of radiation. New research has found concentrated levels of radiation in some of New Zealand's favorite seafood, including bluff oysters, shipjack tuna, green shell mussels, pollock, queen scallop, rock lobster, and little neck clams. I guess they even affect the video for those of you on HD. Chemical contaminants in seafood can cause significant health problems, the researchers said. If eating fish is culturally important to you, or you rely on fishing and shellfish collection to feed your family, you're most at risk. In 2011, the Fukushima meltdown was most likely to blame for the high levels of radiation. That you don't say. How many times have you guys heard instances where they have said that they use the information from the fallout of Nagasaki and the bombings of World War II in Japan? They have used data collected on cancer rates from that explosion to measure meltdown and fallout issues for any kind of accident that's happened since. Well, that's quite faulty, and I have a lot of science here to back up why that is. Theecologist.org. After Hiroshima, how about that, and Nagasaki, a third nuclear atrocity, which was, of course, the corruption of science. Listen to this. Following the atomic bombs exploded over Japan in 1945, a second crime against humanity took place, writes Chris Busby. And when Chris Busby speaks, he's who wrote this. You want to listen. He's probably the most brilliant mind with all things nuclear alive today, Dr. Chris Busby. The deliberate falsification of science to hide the dangers of ionizing radiation, he writes, perpetuated to quell public opposition to a new age of nuclear bombs and energy. The fraud continues to this day, but finally the truth is winning out. Good news. On the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, articles are appearing everywhere discussing the historical, philosophical, scientific, public health, and social meaning of this event. I almost wrote war crime, and you could argue that he should have, because we didn't have to do that. We were actually warned that we were warned about Pearl Harbor before it ever happened, for one thing. But that's stick with the article. Sam gets sidetracked too much. The bombings can be extrapolated onward in time through the atmospheric testing fallout and Chernobyl to the more recent contamination in Japan after Fukushima. Today, Chris Busby writes, the analysis of the health risks from the Japanese A-bombs is being cleverly twisted to provide a rationale for the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Did you hear that? Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not just some historical tableau that we can weep crocodile tears over and discuss as socio-historic phenomena. They are here today, present as ghosts in all the manipulations and devious calculations made by the international radiation risk agencies and nuclear industry scientists, giving results that continue to permit the release into the environment of the same deadly substances that emerged for the first time in 1945. How many of you don't know this? A lot of the elements that are created in nuclear explosions did not exist on the planet till we did this. That's why it's so devastating to our bodies, because it's not supposed to be here. And it's a poison is what it is. Abusing Hiroshima to deny nuclear bomb health damage. Please listen to this. I am currently presenting a case to the British atomic test veterans in the Royal Courts of Justice in London. The case pivots on the faulty radiation and health risk model that is based on the lifespan study of the Japanese A-bomb survivors. This model of the International Commission of Radiological Protection is used by the Ministry of Defense in the courts to deny responsibility for the cancers in the nuclear test veterans and the congenital disease of the children and grandchildren. In other words, they're saying, based on faulty data, that they're not responsible for the destruction of these families. However, the Hiroshima model also predicts that those exposed to radiation and fallout from future nuclear exchanges would suffer little downstream genetic damage. Thus, the Dr. Strangelove and generals can argue that the nuclear war is in fact winnable, and that the increases in cancer and genetic effects in those exposed to depleted uranium in Iraq somehow don't exist. He's talking about two things at once there. One is, if they wanted to use nuclear weapons against North Korea, because of course they've been threatening us with it forever now, they would argue that they could do a small nuclear attack in North Korea that would not affect the people in the South. And they would be using the faulty data that is based on bad science from the World War II bombings to make that case. And he's explaining why that isn't the best way to go, why that is in fact quackery, not science. Second of all, we use something called depleted uranium in Iraq. And depleted uranium is something that makes projectiles explode like bullets and whatnot. This is creating a health problem, such as isn't really seen except in places like the earlier mentioned Belarus. So he's also mentioning that depleted uranium need to be taken off the battlefield immediately and never used. Said the bogus analysis of the health outcomes from the Hiroshima has left the world with a major public health problem. In an effort to refute the mounting evidence, the ICRP model was relaunched by the Lancet to coincide with the Hiroshima anniversary. A whole issue is given over to the Presako accounts of the health consequences of Fukushima, Chernobyl, and Fukushima through articles, at least partly written by those who hold the reins of the ICRP chariot. In other words, there's people who have an investment in having these studies come out the way they want because they're invested in Nuke, and they're not objective at all. They're deliberately skewing the science. The linkage between Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Fukushima are thus more than just symbolic, having shaped the current health management practices and the institutions that run them, as well as public responses to these events. However, these current health management practices are widely in error. Listen to this about nuclear war. Everyone has seen the photos of Hiroshima. The primitive uranium-235 bomb Hiroshima with an explosive power of 13 kilotons, that is 13,000 tons of TNT, which of course was the non-nuclear explosive, chemical explosive. It flattened the city and killed 80,000 people, of which 45,000 died on the first day. Within 4 months, the death toll was about 140,000 people. 3 days after Hiroshima, a 20 kiloton plutonium bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Why? Did the U.S. think perhaps the Hiroshima bomb might have been overlooked? That's a good question, he asks. Both weapons were mostly made of uranium. Note that since then, from 1950, a study of the survivors by the U.S.-funded Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, and later the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, has defined the relationship between radiation dose and cancer. This is terrible. Listen to this. In passing, recall that the explosive power was 13 kilotons. Anyone who wants nightmares should buy the standard work, The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, by Samuel Gladstone, the physical chemist. The more recent versions of this book have a nifty little plastic calculator in the back, where you may, by rotating the bezel, inform yourself of the radii of the blast, radiation dose, building destruction, or size of the bomb. The U.S. has spent lots of money and time blowing up stuff in Nevada and the Pacific test sites to obtain this data. Keep in mind, it's one of the things that killed John Wayne. Modern thermonuclear warheads, of which there are currently some 150,000, pack 800 kilotons of TNT. Just one of these jobs would put paid to most of New York, Tehran, or Jerusalem. Imagine New York, just one of them. I visualize some poor civil defense chief sitting in a shelter somewhere desperately twisting the scales of this petty nuclear bomb effects computer developed by the Lovelace Institute, waiting from the ground to disappear. In other words, what we're talking about now is so much bigger and so much more destructive, and some of these elements, in ways that are long and boring, go up in orders of magnitude, not just regular percentages. Says nuclear war is not longer unthinkable. I think they meant no longer. They wrote not longer unthinkable. The problem we have in the world in 2015 is that the economic system and power relations between countries encourages those taking big decisions to think in terms of geopolitical strategies that include the use of nuclear weapons. In other words, countries have not ruled out these devices of death. Says there are potential resource wars. There are food production issues following changes in global weather patterns. There are technological developments in what were historically manipulatable countries. Nuclear weapons are now in the hands of 9 nations, including 3 which are not party to the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. That would be India, Pakistan, and North Korea. And again, of all of them, North Korea being one of the most unstable countries in all of history, and they have a bomb. Negotiations with Iran are currently argued to be of tremendous importance in a region that has the nuclear potential to wipe out the local Arab states at a sitting. Of course, we know what the fallout then would do to Israel, so that's not something that should be on the table. And I think a lot of that is what Busby is saying here. The Russians have massive nuclear capabilities and are being baited to their borders in Ukraine by NATO and those who control NATO. That is very true. This shirt stirring now has moved to the Baltic states. He writes, I live in Latvia. In the spring, I saw a new tank from the Latvian flag rolling through the center of Rapazi, a small town 40 kilometers west of Riga, near where I live. Every day, the sky overhead had big helicopters and transport aircraft donated to the Latvians by the U.S. But why? The Baltic states and Poland are conscripting armies to defend the motherland against invasions by the Russians. So what's going on? Well, listen to this. A systemic cover-up of nuclear dangers. And all the high-level strategic thinking that is associated with this nuclear warmongering, the post-attack population death yields from the fallout are computed according to the ICRP risk model. But that Hiroshima model is a chemical construction built in the Cold War to back up the atmospheric testing. The observable effects, which is increases in infant mortality and the 1980s cancer epidemic, were covered up following a 1959 agreement. There's a link here if you want to read it, between the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization, which left the IAEA, the nuclear physicists, the bomb makers, and the deniers of Chernobyl and Fukushima's effects in charge of the research into health. In other words, they had the science deck stacked before the game ever started. So it remains to this day, with the Lancet article, Long-Term Effects of Radiation Exposure on Health. Another link. Co-written by particle physicist Richard Wakeford, ex-head of research of British nuclear fuels at Sellafield, the nuclear industry representative in the UK SERI committee, member of the ICRP, advisor to the Japanese on Fukushima, and so forth. The evidence from real studies of the offspring of the test veterans and the soldiers and civilians exposed to depleted uranium is that a nuclear war will end life on Earth as we know it. The test veterans have tenfold excess rift effects, ninefold in the grandchildren. Although millions will be blasted away, the real outcome will be the global sterility, cancer, and malformation. All of the Mad Max stuff, but worse. Hollywood got it right. In other words, even if you live, you won't be able to have kids, and you will be miserable, and you will be sick, starving, freezing, and everything you know about the world and everything you've ever learned in it. We'll be back to the days of the cavemen. And it's what Einstein said when he said we use rocks on the other side. Evidence and errors in the Hiroshima lifespan studies. If you find that there is a doubling of breast cancer or child leukemia in those living downwind of a nuclear power station, as I mentioned earlier, at an estimated dose less than external background, the ICRP model tells you that the effect cannot be due to the releases from the power station because the dose is too low. It's safe. The epidemiologist Martin Tundle found in 2004 that there was a significant excess cancer risk in northern Sweden after Chernobyl. And that's why, again, nuclear power, it's not that Iran should be free to do it. It's that nobody should be free to do it because it doesn't just affect you. When Russia melted down Chernobyl, it affected Sweden. Therefore, Sweden shouldn't have had a say in an opening. He was told to shut up because what he found was impossible. In other words, the dose was again too low. The same in Belarus and the Ukraine, where my colleague Alexei Yablokov, Yablokov, was collected together an enormous compilation of peer-reviewed evidence of appalling effects. Most recently, we see the Hiroshima-based denials in the case of thyroid cancer in Fukushima. The study groups for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, and it's a probe assembled in 1950. Thus, there were 5 years in which those who were badly affected by the radiation could die. They'd already passed on, so they didn't count in the study. The study was a healthy survivor group, something which the late Dr. Alice Stewart demonstrated. In other words, you see how they skewed that? They waited 5 years so that the numbers would come down in their favor. Says it's not the worst accusation. There were roughly 109,000 individuals recruited, including 6 dose groups from 0 to 200 rad and 2 not in city groups. They 4,607 early entrants and 21,915 late entrants. Again, test groups. These NIC groups should have been the controls, but they were not. If you look at the reports, you find that they were abandoned as being too healthy. The final exposure groups were defined by how far they were from the detonation. In other words, that wasn't the most accurate way to test it, for the reason I just gave you. All groups were exposed to residual radioactivity from the bombs. The U.S. and ABCC denied and still denies this. But it's true. They were exposed to residual radioactivity from the bombs. There were internal exposures to all groups, whatever their external dose had been. They were never tested inside. Internal is much worse. Look at the movie Silkwood or read her biography. Uranium, a genetic poison. What's it do? It targets the DNA, the building blocks of life. The origin of the Black Rain, which contained uranium-235 and uranium-238, and particularly uranium-234, which is the missing exposure and is probably responsible for most of the cancer effects in all survivors. We know that the uranium was there because it was measured by Japanese scientists in 1983. A recently declassified U.S. document tabulates the enormous U-234 content of the enriched uranium used in bombs, code name Oralloy. The uranium nanoparticles in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki black rain were available for inhalation by the exposure groups in the ruins of Hiroshima for years after the bomb. And again, how many of you remember the black goo that's all over Tokyo? It's called a melt out when it happens that way, by the way. All the bombs were made of uranium, about 1 ton per megaton yield. For all those tests in Nevada, the Marshall Islands, Kazakhstan, Christmas Island, the results were the same. Down came nanoparticles to be inhaled by anyone nearby and distant. You inhale it into your lungs, and it affects your health. It gives off these microscopic explosions that mutate your cells, and that turns into cancer, along with other things. It affects your heart, it affects your weight, it affects a number of things. The way you process sugars. Why does this matter, he asks. The new research has been carried out on uranium. We find that uranium targets DNA through the chemical affinity. This causes terrible and anomalous genetic damage out of all proportion to its dose, as calculated by the ICRP. Other fallout components also bind chemically to DNA, including strontium-90 and barium-140. Again, look at his work on calcium and what you can do to protect from some of the damage by taking calcium, because strontium is related to it and it mimics it. But are you seeing what he's saying here? The doses of what the people that are saying it's safe at the ICRP are saying it's not safe because of the way uranium acts and reacts with other things in the body. It says those exposed who are uranium miners, thank you, Queen of England, Gulf veterans, test veterans, DU civilians, that would be depleted uranium in weapons, nuclear uranium workers, nuclear site downwinders, all suffer chromosome damage, cancer, leukemia, heart disease, the works. The wakes. All this is published as are results of laboratory and theoretical studies showing mechanisms. But in the Lancet, nothing. Of course, not safe. All these sources I've given you, they all made it up on a whole cloth. They became doctors for nothing. S.L. Simon and Abe Alver, who wrote the article on the health effects of the nuclear testing, did not even mention uranium there, nor in their epic 2010 study of the Marshall Islands exposure. The Nevada site data they used for the baseline calculations ignored it totally. In other words, they'll test for cesium, they'll test for they weren't testing for uranium because they knew exactly what they were going to find and it was going to show the truth, and they couldn't have the truth. They had to have the lies. In 2012, I made a presentation, he writes, for the Marshall Islanders at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, attacking the Simon et al. Analysis. In their Lancet nuclear test article, Simon and Belville major on iodine effects. So let's look at those. Scientific evidence from Fukushima, massive excess in thyroid cancers, again, caused by the radioactive iodine. To tie this all together, listen. In Fukushima Prefecture, surveys have confirmed 103 thyroid cancers in 380,000 18-year-olds. 25 or so are still being checked out, so there could be more. The Lancet article by Wakeford presents an excess relative risk called from the Hiroshima studies of 0.6 per sievert. In the very same issue, the maximum thyroid dose was given as 18 msieverts with a medium dose of 0.67 msieverts. So in 2 years of screening, if everyone screened got the maximum thyroid dose of 18 msieverts, we should expect an increase of 0.08 times 0.06 equaling 0.011, which would be, of course, a 1.1 increase in the background rate. This background is about 1 per 100,000 per year, or 7.6 in 2 years and 380,000. So the radiation should increase this to 7.7 cases. That would be one extra case in 10 years. There are about 103 That is 95 more cases than expected. An error in the ICRP model of 95 over 0.14, which would be 678-fold. That is, there is 678 times more thyroid cancer than the Hiroshima-based ICRP model predicts. They were wrong by 678 times. The calculation is based on what was written in Lancet, but nobody made the calculation. This own should show the authorities and the public that the game is up. But instead of doing the simple calculation, another article in the Lancet written by Jeff Watts praises the work of those at Fukushima Medical University who are busy telling everyone that the increases in thyroid cancer cannot be caused by the radiation. How dumb do they think people are? In other words, once again, the predictions from the Hiroshima are believed rather than the evidence that is right in front of their eyes. It's kind of a mass hypnosis, or maybe not. And lastly, finally, someone is trying to get to the truth of the matter. In case you think that all of this mad stuff, in case you think this is all mad stuff, there does at least seem to be some measure of concern evolving in the area of the internal radiation, though no one at the Lancet articles mentions it. The European Union Radiation Research Organization, MELODY, has finally moved into action, led by the French Radiation Protection Agency, IRSN. The matter was raised by me, he writes, at the inaugural MELODY conference in Paris in 2011, but nothing seemed to develop. I said that there are likely to be dose estimation problems associated with internal exposure, that is inside of you, and to nucleides which bind to DNA, and particularly uranium, that this potentially falsified the Hiroshima risk model. A hugely expensive European research project has now been proposed. It is CURE, Concerted Uranium Research Europe. In the report launching this development in March of 2015, the authors wrote a large-scale integrated collaborative project will be proposed to improve the characterization of the biological and health effects associated with uranium internal contamination in Europe. In the future, it might be envisaged to extend the collaborations with other countries outside the European Union, to apply the proposed approach to other internal emitters and other exposure situations of internal contamination. In other words, other ways that this gets to you. In the future, Hiroshima should not be remembered just for destruction of its inhabitants, but also for being the flag for the epidemical cover-up of the biggest public health scandal in all of human history, whose victim number the hundreds of millions in cancer death, miscarriages, infant death, loss of fertility, and the introduction of genomic instability on all creatures living on the earth. It's changed the DNA and genetic makeup of everything for the worse. Let us pray that we want to be allowed to sanction the final nuclear exchange or the mistaken prediction that such an event could be winnable. I know that a little bit long, but Chris Busby completely on point there, friends, in every way. This is brought to you by Mike McLaughlin. You can look him up at facebook.com, MLAUGHLIN. Iran made illegal purchases of nuclear weapons technology last month. I have said since the beginning that this is not a matter of Jew or Arab. It's not a matter of the Jews got a nuclear power plant. We should get one. Shut your turban up. Listen. You can't have a nuclear power plant there because it is seismically scientific fact that you are going to experience an earthquake there somewhere around the massive scale that you saw in Fukushima. And we all know that the shaking caused some of the meltdowns at Fukushima. Therefore, this is going to bring more grief upon Iran than any number of Jewish anything could do or anybody else. The other problem here, though, is that Iran is extremely untrustworthy, and you don't always hear that. It's not politically correct to say, well, at Weekly Standard, listen to this. The question is not whether Iran can be trusted to uphold the nuclear deal that is now being negotiated in Vienna, because it can't, but whether the Obama administration and its P5+1 partners can be trusted to punish Iran when it violates the agreement. Experience shows that unless Iran violates the deal egregiously, the temptation will be just to ignore it, and we know where that's going to go. For instance, Iran got away with selling more oil than it should have under the interim agreement. More ominously, Tehran repeatedly pushed the envelope on technical aspects of the agreement, such as caps on its uranium stockpile, and they got away with it. The Obama administration and other Western powers have so much invested in the diplomatic efforts that they'll deny such violations ever occurred. And you can see by the way that Obama is handling ISIS that at the very least he is a Islamic sympathizer. And the problem with that is dying of thirst, excuse me. The problem with that isn't that your average Islamist is a problem, but the leader of these countries are a huge problem. And we have a president that's helping them with this insanity. More evidence of Iranian violations has now surfaced. 2 reports regarding Iran's attempts to illicitly and clandestinely procure technology for its nuclear and ballistic missiles programs has been recently published. They show that Iran's procurement continues apace, if not faster than before. A joint plan of action was signed in November 2013. Fear of potentially embarrassing negotiators and derailing negotiations made some states reluctant to report it. In other words, they caught Iran cheating, and the countries in the P1+5 did not want to admit that they were wrong in trusting Iran, so they just ignored the fact that it happened. They just pretend that Iran is trustworthy, right? Keep repeating the party line because you're an idiot. The first report linked to it here was released last month by the UN panel on experts in charge of reporting compliance with the UN Security Council resolutions regarding Iran. The panel noted that UN member states had not reported significant violations of UN sanctions and speculated as to why. Either Iran was complying or countries did not wish to interfere with negotiations. In other words, just let Iran, go ahead with this. We can trust them even though they're already cheating and lying. The second report released last week by Germany's Domestic Intelligence Agency is less ambiguous. The agency, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, confirmed to us that Iran continues to seek illicit technology for its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. They are looking for ways to put nuclear technology on a bomb, and they have been caught in this report. So quit telling me how much you can trust Iran, because obviously we have proof right here that you cannot. Iran has had a long history of trying to obtain nuclear technology from German companies, particularly by seeking ways to transport merchandise in circumvention of international sanctions. In other words, the things that got the Lusitania sank. Go ahead and, we'll call it regular cargo. Ship us over some nuclear materials for our bombs. Don't tell anybody. Since November 2013, Tehran has sought industry computers, high-speed cameras, cable fiber, and pumps for its nuclear and missile programs. It appears that Iran's readiness to negotiate does not reflect any substantive policy change. Rather, it is a diplomatic tactic, a retreat forced by economic distress, not a strategic rethinking of its priorities. Iran's cheating should give Western, that would be us, negotiators, additional resolve to impose ironclad guarantees in the agreement. We're not even allowed to spot check them. You know that? They should compel Iran to reveal its past activities, including its post-JPOA procurement efforts, and impose tough, intrusive, anytime, anywhere inspections before sanctions are suspended, much less lifted. And of course, instead, last week we find out that, reporting to the UN, despite evidence of cheating and lack of resolve, it looks as though they're going to get to move ahead with this ridiculous notion. It's mind-numbing how evil this regime is, and people want to give them a nuclear anything. They shouldn't be allowed to operate a car battery. RT.com, 2 million people in California, Midwest drink uranium-contaminated water. Let's hear again how the bomb testing didn't hurt anything. I wondered if anybody could tell me that that we're not getting any effects from these power plants. Just listen to this. Almost 2 million people in California and the Midwest live on the aquifer sites, which have 180 times the safe level of uranium, according to a recent study by U.S. researchers. 180 times higher. Do you know how deadly uranium is? Do you know a speck of plutonium that would fit on the head of a pin could poison an entire apartment complex. Do you know that? Some 275,000 groundwater samples were taken for evaluation, and it turns out that many Americans live about a kilometer from wells that are uranium polluted. Scientists from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln discovered. And you didn't hear that on the news, right? It doesn't matter. It's just uranium. We just heard what uranium did. The 20-minute Chris Busby thing I just gave you. Here you go. 180 times higher. In case you think it only affected Europe and the Middle East. 78% of the pollution comes from nitrate, the contaminator deriving from chemical fertilizers and animal waste. Nitrates oxidize uranium, making it soluble in groundwater. Yeah, nothing to do with the nuke industry. Nah, not at all. The aquifers are under a rich soil layer, which is fertilized by nitrates. Yeah, I get nothing to do with any of the bomb testing that happened there, nothing to do with any nuclear power plants. I wanted to touch on it, though, so that it wasn't glossed over and you can understand how dreadful this is. And friends, we've gone long today. This brings us to the Dumdy of the day. And yes, Fukushima does in fact have a Dumdy of the day. Remember, you can donate to the show at thecorrectviews@hotmail.com, where every penny that you give to me goes towards a better show. And these things can be expensive to do because of all of the time it takes for me to research these. Friends, the Dumdy of the day. Let me get our Dumdy music up. Oh, yeah, listen to this. Come on, computer, come on. USGS scientists, major quake on Hayward Fault expected any day now. You'll see why I mentioned this as the Dumdy of the day here in a second. You don't get it yet, but trust me, you will. That was an awful fade. San Francisco, CBSSocial.com. I hate this site. It's so clunky. It takes forever to scroll or move. Oh, now it wants to refresh. You can always count on major news networks to do these kinds of annoying things. We've been told it's safe. Don't worry. It's safe. It's safe. It's safe. We have an earthquake about to happen here that is going to absolutely change damn near everything as we know it in the site of these power plants that are in the area. When this happens, and it's not a matter of if. I mean, seismologists have told us forever there is no if, there's when. You have all these pro-nuke people out here who get the Dumdy of the day, by the way, saying how we need this for the good of global warming. What good is any of that if you have poisoned all of life to a far greater degree than any global warming would do? As Rush Limbaugh likes to say, anything for the caribou. Well, let me ask you a question. How does it help the mighty caribou if there is an earthquake of this magnitude that we're talking about here at Xfinity.com on this fault line, and it does the damage that we know that we saw the earthquakes do in Japan? I guess I want to say in closing, as we close the day one here of the massive Fukushima update, that this isn't the only fault line where this is looking at. And they're discovering more fault lines all the time. And we're finding out that the Earth is a lot less stable than it has been for the last few hundred years that we've been able to test it properly. And that's putting our nuke plants at risk. It's putting you listening to this at risk. Friends, I've been going on for about an hour. We got the Dumdy of the day here. We've got the facts for you. Hit share. Let people know we're out here. Go to themediaspeaks.com. Let them know that you support what we're doing here and you're helping us and keeping us going. Because, friends, if more people do not wake up to the mess that we have here, then there's not going to be any reason for us to worry about whether or not driving your car warms the planet, which we know that it doesn't. What we're going to be looking at is an extinction event that hasn't been seen by anyone at any time. I mean, human-wise. I mean, the last time anything like this happened was the dinosaurs. So, friends, that's the facts as we know them. Please share the video, and I'll be back with day 2 of this. Good night. God bless. And that was so slow.